Welcome back to my channel. My name is Jordan and I officially have a mic. Don't know if you can see this beauty right here. Anyway, you guys do not care about that. What you guys do care about, I'm sure, is the O.J. Simpson trial. I'm gonna cover it today. We are gonna do an in-depth analysis, but not take 252 days to do it like the trial did. I'm gonna make this quick. I'm gonna make it easy to understand. We're gonna break it down and we're gonna figure out why O.J. Simpson was found not guilty. So let's talk about who was involved in this case first, familiarize ourselves with the parties. We have O.J. Simpson. He was a former NFL player, household name. He did commercials, endorsements, things like that. He was married to Nicole Brown Simpson from 1985 to 1992. And they had a turbulent relationship. She reported domestic abuse on multiple occasions. It was kind of known that he was physically abusive towards her. And in 1994, 2 years after the divorce, she was living separately about 5 minutes down the road from him. And she was found dead outside of her home with this man by the name of Ronald Goldman. Now, Ronald Goldman was a waiter at a restaurant that Nicole had been at. He was returning glasses that she had left behind, and it was kind of a wrong place, wrong time kind of thing. I mean, who really knows the extent of their relationship? But what we do know from the case and the information that we do have, he was just returning glasses and happened to be there at the wrong time. So their bodies were found stabbed to death. Her throat was slit. He was stabbed, I want to say, around 30 times. Their bodies were found shortly after midnight, although the killings happened around 9:30 to 10:30, somewhere in that time frame. The exact time is disputed, but between the defense and the prosecution, it happened between 9:30 and 10:30. Now, where was OJ during this time? OJ doesn't have an alibi, okay? So that's the first clue. He doesn't have an alibi as to where he was. He went out that night with a friend of his to get a burger at McDonald's. They returned home around 9:20. His friend who he went to McDonald's with happened to live on the property in the guest house. His name is Kato Kalin. He's an actor. He went back into his guest house around 9:20. He was on the phone with a friend, and he doesn't know where OJ was after that. The Bronco, which is what, if you're not familiar with the famous white Bronco, that is the car that OJ drove, and it was not in the driveway during this time frame. How do we know that? Because OJ had a flight booked to Chicago that night out of LAX, and he was having a limo driver come pick him up at home. When the limo driver got there, the white Bronco was not in the driveway. He was buzzing the intercom. No one was answering. And then about 20 minutes later, he sees a 6 foot, 200-pound black male walking into the entrance of the home in a hoodie and dark clothing. So when he sees the man entering the house, he rings the intercom again because he says, okay, someone's home now. And now this time picks up, it's OJ, and he says, I overslept, I was in the shower, I'll be down in a minute. Okay, take that for what you will. It's very, very, very fishy. So that is pretty much the intro to the story. Let's get into the trial. Let's talk about the evidence presented against OJ. What was presented that could have led a person to believe OJ committed these crimes? One was the fact that he didn't have an alibi. The second was the fact that there was a blood trail leaving the crime scene, and that same blood trail was found entering OJ's house in the foyer of his home and in the master bedroom of his home. When these samples of blood were collected, it was found that this blood matched the profiles of OJ, Nicole Brown Simpson, and Ronald Goldman. What else? There was a glove, a blood-soaked glove found at the crime scene. The match to that glove was found on OJ's property. Again, the blood on those gloves matched OJ, Nicole, and Ronald. And then we had the limo driver who testified to the fact that OJ wasn't answering the intercom, and then he sees this 6 foot, 200-pound black male entering the house. Up until this time, there was no Bronco in the driveway, so arguably OJ was not home during this time frame, and then all of a sudden he gets home and he's home, he's ready to go. And then he also testified to the fact that on the way to the airport, OJ was sweating, he was very hot. It was like 68 degrees out this night. He had the windows down, he needed the driver to crank the AC up. He kept, saying to the driver, are you hot? And the driver was fine. So that could lead maybe a reasonable person to believe that he was sweating because he was nervous about all the events that just transpired if he did murder Nicole and Ronald. There was also a 911 call played in which Nicole is reporting O.J. Simpson for his violent behavior. And there was a bloody footprint at the crime scene. This is like straight out of a movie, I swear. Bloody footprint at the crime scene. It matched a type of shoe called a Bruno Magli shoe. Now, OJ denied ever having this shoe. He said he wouldn't wear it because it was ugly. It matched a size 12 shoe. OJ wore a size 12 shoe, but the jury never saw photos of OJ in this exact shoe until after the fact when these photos came out in the civil trial that followed, and we'll get into that later. But there was evidence that there was a bloody shoe print. It was a Bruno Magli shoe, size 12, and the jurors did know that OJ wore a size 12 shoe. You might hear this evidence and say, okay, how was OJ found not guilty? Obviously, he wasn't home at the time of the crime. He had motive. I mean, he was physically violent to Nicole in the past. He maybe didn't like that she was there with another man. He had blood stains leading in his house that matched the blood stains at the crime scene. He wore the same size shoe as the footprint that was found at the crime scene. The blood-stained glove was found on his property and it matched the one at the crime scene. Like, if you're like me, you're sitting here saying, how did this jury return a not guilty verdict? Well, let's get into the LAPD and the inconsistencies in the state's case, because that is ultimately the reason why OJ won this case. In my opinion, this came down to just about one witness, and his name was Mark Furman. He was a detective with the LAPD, and he did not bode well for the state's case. Let's just put it that way. So keep in mind, at this time, there was the 1992 beating of Rodney King by the LAPD, where none of the LAPD officers were charged in connection with that beating, even though it was so obvious that they assaulted and battered Rodney King for no good reason. So there was a lot of tension between the African American community in LA and the LAPD. So let's talk about who Mark Furman is. So the state called Mark Furman as a witness, and he was one of the detectives on the scene of the crime, and he testified to the fact that the one bloody glove at the crime scene matched the bloody glove that he found on OJ's property. He testified to the blood stains, the trail that matched up with the crime scene and OJ's house, the foyer and the master bedroom. He had also actually responded to a domestic violence call by Nicole Brown Simpson in the past involving OJ, and when he arrived, Nicole was in her car hiding and OJ was attempting to break the windshield with a bat. So he knows of their relationship, and he was there the night of the crime. He testified to everything. It was great testimony to start. Then comes cross-examination. During cross-examination, OJ's attorneys, from the beginning, OJ's attorneys made this case about race, and they knew that their best defense, and look, when you're lawyering, you gotta put forth the best defense for your client, whether or not it's the right defense. Whatever defense is gonna work for your client, that is what you have to put forward. And they knew that there was a lot of distrust with the LAPD. They knew that there was a big racial problem happening, and they used that to their advantage. Rightfully so. That the attorney has to work for their client's best interests. And on cross-examination, they asked Mark Furman if he has used the N-word in the last decade, I believe it was decade, to describe a member of the African American community. At first, he was a little iffy on his answer, and OJ's attorney said, "Are you saying that you wouldn't remember if you used the N-word in the last decade?" And he was like, "Well, no, I would remember." He said, "Okay, so is it your testimony that you have not used the N-word in the last decade to describe a member of the African American community?" And he said, "Yes, that is my testimony. I have not used the N-word in the last 10 years. And OJ's attorney said, "So if someone says that you said the N-word in the last 10 years, they're lying." And Mark Furman said, "Yes, they're lying." So what does OJ's attorney do? He goes and he gets recordings of Mark Furman using the N-word on various occasions, many, many, many times. And only 2 of these occasions were actually allowed into evidence. The jury heard them. The moment that happens, all of Mark Furman's testimony is wiped. You have a jury that's 62% African American, and you're listening to a man use the N-word in a derogatory fashion after he just testified under oath that he hasn't used the N-word in the last 10 years. Not a good look. When he was called back onto the stand and these tapes were played, he pled the fifth to every question they asked of him, including, and this is what really sealed the defense's case in my opinion, they asked him, did you plant any evidence in connection with this case? And he pled the fifth. I mean, come on! You know what's going to happen after that. And even the prosecution said after that, they knew their case was essentially done. Because of this testimony, hear me out. If you hear a witness testify that they have to plead the fifth when asked if they planted evidence in a case, do you not automatically have a little bit of doubt? That's reasonable doubt. If you hear someone say that they may or may not have planted the evidence and they can't adamantly deny that claim, that's reasonable doubt. So the state had the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt. They had to prove O.J. Simpson beyond that doubt. And that was hard to do. Also, DNA evidence was very new and no one could understand it. They spent a month of this trial trying to explain to the jurors what DNA even is and how DNA evidence is used and how the testing process works. And even some of the seasoned lawyers said that they couldn't even understand how the experts were explaining it. Because DNA evidence was so new and the experts didn't know how to convey it in layman's terms for everyone to understand, the jurors essentially threw it out. Like they just gave up on understanding what DNA evidence was. And because it hadn't been used that much, it wasn't an established, credible method of evidence. Like, rightfully so, they doubted it a bit. So timing was right in that sense. And when I say timing was right, I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm saying timing was right for OJ's case, because not only did the jurors not understand DNA evidence, which linked him to the crime, but there was all this tension between the LAPD and the members of the African American community, which O.J. Simpson was. So when you put those two together, and then you throw in the inconsistencies of the LAPD, which I haven't even finished with yet, you're going to get a not guilty verdict. So the other inconsistency with the LAPD is the fact that there was a vial of blood, O.J. Simpson's blood, and it was 1.5 milliliters in this vial, and there were two different pictures of this same vial, and they were taken hours apart. It may have been a day apart, I'm not sure. But in the first picture, the vial is filled to the brim. In the second picture, guess what? There's a quarter of the blood missing, 30 drops. No one could testify as to where the blood went. What kind of look does that give? On top of this, on top of blood from the sample vial being missing, which shouldn't happen, the detective that had the vial in his possession testified to holding on to it for a few hours before he eventually turned it over for testing. And during those few hours, he even was at the crime scene for a period of time. So you're telling me that in the time that you had possession of this vial, 30 drops of blood went missing, and you were at the crime scene, and you have no explanation as to where the blood went. No one can explain it. Come on. So you see what I mean here with the inconsistencies of the LAPD? The state didn't have a strong enough case. There were too many holes in the case. Now, we can't move on from this case without talking about the infamous glove. So you remember that blood-stained glove, the blood-soaked glove that was found on OJ's property that matched the glove at the crime scene? Well, at the trial, OJ's attorney put the glove on his hand. And he said, now if this glove can't fit me, it can't fit OJ. And he was essentially baiting the prosecution. He wanted the prosecution to have OJ try on the glove. So what did they do? The prosecution fell for it. They asked OJ to try on the glove. OJ put it on, and it was really, really tight. It couldn't fit. Now keep in mind that when he tried these on, he also had latex gloves under it, so he didn't tamper with the evidence. So he puts these gloves on, he shows his hands to the jury, and from there on, the defense's main line was, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. It's a good one. You can't say it's not a good one. It's a good one. In relation to these gloves, they presented evidence that these gloves were only sold to Bloomingdale's, and Nicole Brown Simpson had a credit card receipt from Bloomingdale's that showed her buying these gloves. They didn't fit her. I can assure you they didn't fit her. The only logical explanation is she bought them for OJ. So that's just another piece of evidence that, okay, yes, you would think that that says OJ's guilty, but when OJ put those gloves on and it didn't fit, and now the defense has that tagline, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. That's it. Let's move on to the verdict. So we know that he was found not guilty, but what you might not know is that when the jurors entered the room, the 12 jurors that were responsible for returning a verdict, they did their initial poll. They wanted to see where everyone stands. That's typically what happens. 10 jurors said not guilty, 2 said guilty. There has to be a unanimous verdict, so now it was up to the jurors to convince the 2 to move to the not guilty side. It wasn't hard to do. It happened very fast. This jury returned a verdict in 4 hours. 4 hours. I'm sorry, but you're not reweighing evidence and looking at everything that was admitted in the case in 252 days in 4 hours. They already had their minds made up. So OJ got off. But it doesn't end there, because we're going to touch briefly on the civil suit that was filed against him after, where he was actually found liable for the wrongful death of Nicole and Ronald. And you might be sitting here saying, how can he be found liable for the wrongful death of these 2 people when he was found not guilty of their murder? That is because civil and criminal trials are 2 completely different situations with different burdens of proof in different courts. It's just a different case altogether. In a civil case, the burden of proof is preponderance of the evidence, which is more than likely yes. So in order to find OJ liable for the deaths of Nicole and Ronald, the jury would have had to have found that it was more than likely that OJ was the one responsible. The burden of proof being lower is a big deal, because it means that they don't have to prove as much. They just need to say that OJ was more than likely liable. So that's what they ultimately did. And they were also shown evidence that the criminal jury wasn't shown, such as pictures of OJ in the exact shoes that made the bloody footprint. So that helped the case. There was some other evidence that was offered that wasn't offered in the criminal trial. And ultimately they found him liable, and they ordered him to pay $33 million in damages, which has not been paid yet. He's paid like $130,000 of that, somewhere around there. And because of interest, that award is now almost double. So it's almost at $70 million, and they can't get him to pay. So that's that. Now you might be asking, well, if they found him liable in the civil trial, can't they try him again in criminal court? No. Because of double jeopardy. You can't try a defendant twice for the same crime. So I wrote down a few of my final thoughts that I just want to recap, although I have said it in indirect ways, but just for finality purposes. Although there was damning evidence that could have, and in my opinion should have, implicated OJ, he ultimately was found not guilty because there was reasonable doubt. The state hadn't proved its case beyond that. And even if the state had proved OJ's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, this case came down to OJ versus the LAPD instead of OJ versus Nicole and Ron. And some of the jurors were admittedly motivated by the recent treatment of African Americans by the LAPD. So the not guilty verdict served as a payback in a sense. And you'll see that stated in documentaries and articles written about the case. That's just the truth. Then the civil trial was about OJ versus Nicole and Ron, not the LAPD, and that's why we saw a different outcome. Ultimately, I think the jury's mind was made up as soon as they went into deliberations. There is no way that they could have finished deliberating in 4 hours if they were really weighing the evidence, looking at the law, etc. Those are my final thoughts. That is the O.J. Simpson trial. I highly, highly, highly recommend you watch documentaries on this case. Case was such a historical moment. There were 140 million people watching this verdict be read live. We thought Johnny Depp had a lot of viewers. It doesn't even touch this case. Please let me know your thoughts. I would love to hear from you guys, and I will see you on my next video.